Hello everyone and welcome to this special webinar from OAG. We've been running monthly webinars for some time now, but this is one of two with a special focus on Southeast Asia and Australasia. And today we're going to be looking at Southeast Asia in particular. The second one is going to be on December the 1st and we'll have more of an Australia-New Zealand slant. If you've not joined us before, then welcome. And if you have joined us before, you're also very welcome. My name is Becca Rowland and I'm a partner with Midas Aviation, based in the UK but working globally, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. In this webinar, we're going to be looking at how far along the path to recovery aviation has got, how vaccinations are making a difference or how perhaps they're not to air travel, what the implications are for some of the countries in the region from the lack of air travel. And throughout, we're going to be drawing on OAG data extracted from or via OAG Analyzer. So we're going to be looking at scheduled airline capacity and traffic volumes to try and understand what's happening and provide insights about what comes next. We're very pleased to have three very knowledgeable guests joining me today, who each bring huge insights to the topics that we're going to be discussing. We've got John Grant, who's OAG's resident chief analyst, and John has a wealth of knowledge from a long career in the industry and isn't short of a few opinions too. So good to have you with us, John. And I gather you're back to flying on business now.
I am, Becca. I've managed to escape the UK and travelled across the Atlantic to Canada last week. So yes, and strange experience, very strange experience. But yeah, good to be with you this morning.
A bit different to how it was pre-COVID.
Lots of QR codes, lots of people who are jobs worth checking those QR codes, and one flight that was completely empty and the other one was totally rammed. So maybe a reflection on where the recovery is generally, actually.
Yeah, a bit interesting, very interesting. I'm sure you're going to have more to say in a bit anyway. We also have Gary Bowerman, who's the director of Check-in Asia and is publishing a weekly newsletter called Asia Travel Reset. Gary's joining us from Kuala Lumpur today, as is Hannah Pearson, who's the director at Pear and a tourism research and sales consultancy, and Hannah's also based in KL. Together, Hannah and Gary host the Southeast Asia Travel Show, a regular podcast keeping us up to date with travel and tourism in the region. So they seem to have exactly the right expertise for what we need today. Good to have you both with us.
Hi, Becca. Good afternoon. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning here. It's an early start for us today, but not for you. Although we aim to have time for questions at the end, we always prefer it if listeners can send in their questions as we're going along. Just use the chat function and then we'll try and answer the questions and pick up the themes as they come in, which just makes for a more interesting discussion, I think. The webinar is being recorded and so you'll get a link to the webinar afterwards. I know it always helps to know that in advance, so there's no need to take notes today. So let's dive into some data. This is a chart looking at how global capacity and capacity by region is changing over time, and it's showing each month's capacity versus where it was in the same month in 2019. John, do you want to kick us off here and tell us what we're seeing in this chart and how is it relevant to particularly Southeast Asia?
Well, yes. I think, Becca, this really is the whole foundation of why we felt this would be interesting to do a couple of dedicated webinars around Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific regions, because whilst the rest of the world has started moving and there is a recovery underway in relative terms, around May and June of this year, every other regional market began to grow and recover, and yet Southwest Pacific and the Southeast Asia regions continue to fall further behind, and we now have a credibility gap really in terms of recovery between the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia that is hugely significant. These are particularly the Southeast Asian region was expected to be one of the fastest growing regional markets in the world. There were numerous aircraft orders. new expansion plans, new runways in Hong Kong, massive development plans in Singapore, and new airports propping up, and still 20 months into the pandemic, the rest of the world has seemed to get to grips with it, and these two regions haven't. And it's, the situation is very fluid. It's changing on a daily basis, and there is more positivity in the last couple of days. But they're languishing behind everyone else, and it's, when you dig into the data, as we will do, it's quite interesting, because the segments that are struggling are the ones that ironically have been the quickest to recover in other parts of the world. So it's a very, very strange situation we're seeing in Southeast Asia. And it just goes to prove, I guess, that every market, as we've said throughout the pandemic, has its own event, its own situations, its own circumstances. And some have done well at managing those, and others perhaps have struggled to get to grips with some of the challenges.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a year or so ago, I'm not thinking specifically in terms of aviation, but we'd have looked at some of those Southeast Asian countries as handling the pandemic better than anywhere else. And yet for aviation, this has been very challenging, hasn't it?
It has. And, I think one of the frustrations and one of the key points that sort of hits me about all of this is, because of the many country markets in Southeast Asia and the lack of coordination between them, whereas in somewhere such as the European Union, for all its faults, when the European Union mandated every country to allow travel to recommence, it meant every country within the European Union effectively opened its borders. Whereas in Southeast Asia, it is on such a bilateral and piecemeal basis that it makes it hard for airlines, and it makes it hard for travelers to actually understand what's going on. And it's just so frustrating, I think, when you see how others have started to grow. And of course, in the Southwest Pacific, we've seen more and more lockdowns in Australia, although some states are now beginning to come out of those. And of course, we have international services starting in December, which will be great. But it just seems to me that they've lost pace with the rest of the recovery. Rather like an 800-meter runner, they did a brilliant first 400, and the last 400 they're walking and being overtaken by everyone.
You can certainly see your comment about Europe. You can see on this chart the where the grey line picks up here, which is where that decision, I guess, was made, and Europe started to open. It's hard to see when I look at this chart and I see this blue line and the green line for Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia, and I think, well, even if they're opening up a bit more now and they're recovering, you sort of extend the line out. It's going to be months and months, isn't it, before we see anywhere like the level of travel that we're seeing, or capacity that we're seeing in some of these other markets?
It may be. One of the real surprises, I think, in some markets around the world has been how quickly demand has recovered. Now, I think we need to be really careful about reading too much into that sudden demand recovery, which is a combination of pent-up demand, revenge spending in some cases, an urgent desire for some reason, which I've never understood, to go and visit your mother-in-law, and such things like that. And it strikes me that it's sort of fueling a very optimistic picture of what the recovery will be like, and that the demand will come back very quickly. And I think perhaps what we will see is demand coming back strongly for maybe the first 6 weeks or the first 2 months when markets reopen. After that point, though, I suspect with the absence of corporate demand, that things are going to plateau back, and we'll be in a relatively soft demand situation for certainly the first quarter.
So
2022.
just to clarify the data, we've had a question in. This is seat. When we talk about seats here, it's the capacity on the plane. So it's not the passenger, it's not the filled seats, it's what the capacity is on the plane. And we show that because that's the data that OAG has going forward into the future, because airlines have filed schedules. So it's a good indicator that's really current about what's happening with airlines. Hannah, Gary, can we bring you in here, and do you want to give us a sort of your view, sort of snapshot of where Southeast Asia is in terms of recovery?
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. So I mean, like you were saying, John and Becca, towards the end of last year, Southeast Asia was doing very well. There were a lot of countries that had pursued this zero COVID policy. Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, even Thailand had very few cases, and domestic travel was relatively strong because they didn't have restrictions. There weren't really many lockdowns going on in the region. And then, of course, we can see, you know, this drop December to January is when the Delta variant really started hitting the region, and it just has taken a battering. And you know, these policies that they were pursuing last year suddenly didn't work. The vaccination rollout was incredibly slow, but it's, you know, coming into Q3 and going into Q4, finally a lot of these restrictions that have been around domestic travel, and many countries have had restrictions, you know, for example in Malaysia, where Gary and I both are, you hadn't been able to travel interstate since January till October. So it's incredibly limited, you know, in terms of aviation, what you could even do in terms of domestic travel. But finally, once these countries are starting to hit a significant level of vaccination, governments have been reinstating these freedoms to be able to travel domestically at least. And now finally, there's this kind of ray of hope as some countries are starting to reopen internationally too. But it's all in a very limited way. What would you say, Gary?
Yeah, well, I totally agree with everything Hannah said there. The Delta wave really was the huge disruptor here. But where we go from here, John made two really good points, I think, comparing Europe and Southeast Asia. And you talked about this revenge spend and this revenge demand. One of the things we don't know in this region is what demand will be. We simply have no idea. You mentioned there, John, that in Europe, the European Union were able to mandate their countries to accept vaccine certifications and to open up pretty much generally across the region. We don't have that in Southeast Asia. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations doesn't have these mechanisms to mandate its countries to do that. So they're all going their own way. They're all trying to create bilateral deals or multilateral deals with other countries, but there is no integrated mechanism in Southeast Asia. And that's one of the big factors about what's going to curtail demand. Well, it is curtailing demand already, but when there is some kind of recovery, because we're just not going to see the flows of flights between countries until there are some agreements between ASEAN countries. And the other point, I guess, that you've highlighted on that graph, which just stands out, is, you know, China's at the top there, but that's purely on domestic demand, domestic capacity. You know, China is the most important market here in Southeast Asia for inbound and outbound travel. And until, which, you know, we'll come to that later, until China really starts flying back in and out of the region, you know, Southeast Asia has a huge mountain to climb.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting and really helpful. So just to pick up on another question, just to clarify, these are seats from each of these regions. So they include domestic, international, and to all other regions. So if we're looking at Southwest Pacific here, it's from Southwest Pacific countries to everywhere else. The next slide we have splits out that domestic and international. So on the left, we've got domestic, and we take two snapshots, 2 years ago, November 2019, and then this month, November 21, just to show the capacity from each of these countries and how it's changed. And then on the right, we've got the international. So we can see, we haven't got China in there, but we've, as we just said, that the number we just saw for China is pretty much all domestic. There's very little international, and we're going to be coming on to talk about the impact of that on other countries in the region in a bit. The standout ones here, John, I think, you know, we'd be looking at Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, all these minus 90%. It's still only 10% of the capacity that was flying 2 years ago, and traffic is even lower, isn't it? Because the planes are less full.
It is, it's horrible. And, you know, that minus 90% in Thailand and Singapore and other such countries, just to put that in the context of China. China has at the moment less than 1% of its normal international capacity that it was operating in November 2019. So you could argue that Thailand, for instance, is doing 10 times better than China, but you can always make a positive in statistics. These are horrible numbers. These are, you know, for many airlines, domestic flying is just an interesting thing they do. It doesn't really make any profit. It generates a bit of cash, but in many cases, domestic flying provides connectivity to international flights where the yields are higher and where the profits can be made. So to see these markets with such very, very low levels of international capacity just highlights how far we have to go, and these markets have to go before they can recover. And of course, if you take Thailand, for example, its national carrier is bankrupt. It's on the verge of collapse, although it has been on the verge of collapse for about 15 years now. Similarly, in the Philippines, Philippine Airlines has collapsed and hopes to restart in January of next year. Malaysia Airlines has some serious issues with its national carrier, who's probably only second to South African Airways in the number of reorganizations and lives that it's had. And of course, Air India has just been sold to the Tata Corporation. So it's a pretty stark picture that we see on this chart, and it just summarizes both the journey that has to be taken, but also the interdependency between each of these countries is just so large, and until something happens and there is a consensus, it will stay that way.
And we've, I know some people might not consider India Southeast Asia. We've included it here because it is a bit different, and it's also a very large market sitting on the edge of the region. And if China international capacity isn't there, then India is an interesting option, isn't it, for some of these markets to look at, which we will come on to. We're going to look at some different data now. This looks quite busy, I know. This is something we've been doing for a while now, is looking at how does that change in international capacity compare to the proportion of the population that have been vaccinated. I think because there was a lot of hope initially that vaccination solves all of these problems, and what we're seeing is that it doesn't necessarily, that it still comes down to policies by governments in countries about travel. And so what you see here is 2 points in time where we've tracked how international capacity has been versus 2019, and what the proportion of the population is that's had at least one dose of vaccine. And we've done that for the 12th of July, or the week of the 12th of July, and the week of the 1st of November. And you can see where they've moved. And I mean, it's quite shocking, really, that all of these countries here on the left, the vaccination rate's gone up, but it hasn't made any difference substantially to international capacity. Gary, we're going to see that change, though, aren't we, over the next little while? We are seeing quite a lot of announcements about more opening, and obviously that there are some markets that are a bit more open now than they have been. So this is going to change over the next few weeks, isn't it?
Well, you'd like to think so. I mean, Hannah said at the beginning that one of the problems we had in this region, across the region, was the vaccine procurement was so slow, and so the actual rollouts didn't start very quickly. The two countries that probably led in terms of stating what they're going to do in terms of meeting their vaccine thresholds are Singapore and Malaysia. They said that they would open up their populations when Malaysia, when it hit 90% of the adult population that was vaccinated, and Singapore when it 80% of its total population. So those have kind of led in that terms. But then throwing a kind of spanner in the works was Thailand, which really reopened at the beginning of this month when it had less than 50% across the country vaccinated. Now, some of the areas where people can travel to, Bangkok, one of those, they do have quite high vaccination rates in those specific destinations, but the actual national coverage is quite low. But then you look down through the vaccination rates through the rest of the region, and the big population countries, so Indonesia and Philippines, are still both very low. They're both below 30% their populations are vaccinated. Vietnam is also around about 30%. So, you know, there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of catch up. And I think these are the reasons that governments are so reticent to do anything more than do sort of sandbox and very, very peripheral reopenings at the moment, because they're not sure that, you know, they've been basically telling their populations throughout the last year, they have to remain safe, you have to stay home, you have to do all these different protocols. So they can't really reopen because the vaccination rates aren't high enough yet. You know, you looked at Australia, Australia really waited, and as you mentioned, John, two states there, New South Wales and Victoria, are starting to reopen because they hit certain thresholds. I think a lot of that is still going to pertain here in Southeast Asia.
But Gary, can these thresholds even realistically be achieved? We've seen in other parts of the world, you know, there are those elements of the population that will not be vaccinated and do not want to be vaccinated, which is, you know, personal choice. But it therefore makes it very difficult to get to these 80% marks on a consistent basis. And if you don't get a cluster of countries up to those high levels, then surely it's going to remain closed unless they change policy.
I think there's that. I think there's another thing to throw into the mix as well. I think a lot of countries are looking at what's happening in China right now, and China is really moving forward with booster vaccination. So China is saying that, you know, it's looking to booster vaccination most of its population, 80% of its population, by the third quarter of next year. So I think a lot of countries in this region are now starting to look at booster vaccinations. There's a lot of talk in the media that some countries might only accept you around the world, not just in Southeast Asia, might only accept visitors if they've actually had three jabs in future. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, John. I agree with you that in some countries it's a little bit more difficult. I think in terms of the countries that have lower vaccinations in Southeast Asia, they will pull up, because I think they've seen that other countries in the region have been able to reopen to some degree once they've done that. But, you know, you look at countries like Indonesia, it has, you know, 280 million people, and Philippines has about 120 million. Having started so late in their vaccination rollout, it takes time to catch up.
And if I add as well, you know, for countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, they're also looking at government mandates for vaccinations as well. So Indonesia, I think this has been in place for most of the year, that, you know, if you've been offered a vaccination and you refuse it, you might not be entitled for government aid. And that's something that the Philippines is also debating whether to implement something similar right now as well. So it's quite a different attitude, I think, in Southeast Asia versus Europe, where I think, you know, there would be a kind of uproar. Even Singapore, you know, if you are unvaccinated from January the 1st, you won't be able to work from your company's office. So there's a lot of factors, you know, vaccination differentiated measures that are encouraging people to get vaccinated here.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Here in Malaysia, like Hannah said, you know, we have to be vaccinated to go into a restaurant or a cafe. You have to show your vaccinated certificate at the door everywhere that you go, to go into a mall, wherever. So, you know, there is that kind of carrot and stick to get vaccinated.
Yeah, so the numbers will come up inevitably, won't they? So it's just going to
Becca, I think we also need to recognise, you know, part of the issue through all of this, of course, and one of the things that we can't deny is that just the way that vaccines were created and the rollout, many of these countries were just quite late in receiving vaccines through no fault of their own.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got another chart coming up. Looks a bit different again. This is actually one that we've borrowed from somewhere else. I saw this last week in a webinar that IATA was hosting, and they've taken the travel stringency, I can't even say that, travel stringency index created by Oxford University, which is a way of sort of quantifying the overall effect of restrictions. And they've weighted it by population, and it just shows over time how it's a sort of a way of looking at how restrictions have changed over time. Obviously, we know that in Southeast Asia there's been quite a lot of change from the 1st of November, and so going forward we'll see fewer restrictions. But sort of interesting, really, that when you look at this, the Asia Pacific doesn't look so far out actually in terms of restrictions compared to some of the regions, but everywhere is still at a sort of level 2. So we're still, it's not as if Southeast Asia is actually a lot worse in terms of restrictions when we look at it in this way. Does that resonate? Does that make sense?
I think it's interesting. I mean, when you first shared this slide with me, my sort of takeaway was, wow, you know, on a scale of 0 to 4, so 5 scaling points, the whole world is still only halfway open, and you know, there's still processes and procedures in place in most parts of the world. And I think that's a great challenge for all of us. It's great to be able to travel again, but you know, my own personal experience, if that's replicated for everyone else in the world as travel reopens, you know, there is so much bureaucracy and so much frustration, and I think just worry that we create for travelers about what pieces of paper you're going to have to require, when you need to fill them in, you know, completing a form to return to the United Kingdom, as an example, 48 hours before you travel back or to the United Kingdom. For anyone who lives in the UK returning home, they probably don't have a printer to print out the form once they've completed it. So, you know, for lots of people, it's very frustrating. I think we're going to have to learn to live with some of these screening processes for the next 2 or 3 years, Becca.
We still don't seem to have a simple way. Gary was just saying, you know, going into a restaurant in Malaysia, you have to show your vaccination, and I've got my vaccine stuff on my phone, but it doesn't feel like we've got to a point where we've got apps on smartphones that just do all of this for us.
Oh no, I mean, I was in a city between Ontario and Quebec. And rather, as in Malaysia, you have to show your vaccine passport and your ID to get into hotels, restaurants, or any location. In one of those 2 provinces in Quebec, they've actually adopted the European Union code, so they can scan your code and you're accepted. And in Ontario, you show the code and they look at you as though you've just got off planet Mars. Because they've not been used to seeing them. So it's a very piecemeal approach, and that's a big problem, I think, for everyone. You know, it allows fraud, it allows people to abuse the system. We need a globally recognized travel passport, quite frankly.
Yeah. Hannah, let me bring you in at this point. On the right of this slide, we've listed some of the recent changes that we know are happening in terms of opening up. So, you know, Thailand is now sort of open to 63 countries without quarantine from the 1st of November. Which of these sort of things excite you? Which are the things that are going to make the difference? Is it Singapore's vaccinated travel lanes? Is it Australia opening up? Is it Thailand?
I mean, for Southeast Asia, I think it's definitely Thailand. And like Gary was saying earlier, I think this big announcement that Thailand was going to reopen to 63 countries without quarantine, but I mean, some people argue it is because you need to spend one night waiting for the test results. This was really the big one. This was really what kick-started other people's announcements. So after that, then Cambodia announced this, the Hanutvel sandbox. Laos has been talking about reopening. Malaysia talking about this Langkawi travel bubble. They really put the cat among the pigeons and with this announcement, because this is the most open that any country in Southeast Asia has been. And as Gary pointed out, it's also got not a particularly high level of vaccination. So I think the whole region is really waiting to see what happens. And so far, they've had a really low infection rate. I think it's less than 0.1% of travelers who have arrived on this test and go scheme, they're calling it, who have actually tested positive for COVID. But this is really the test case. You know, if it fails and we see spikes in cases being caused from this, that's really going to make the rest of the region very reticent about opening up again. I mean, Singapore's vaccine travel lanes are the other way of approaching it. So Singapore always talks about doing things in a really calibrated way. They love that word, calibrated, and they're really very selective, and they're always picking things, and things are gradual. So it's kind of the opposite. Again, they've had a really low infectivity rate, I think less than about 0.1% again. But it's slow. I mean, right now they've got about 16 vaccinated travel lanes, but there's a quota. You can only they can only have 6,000 inbound passengers per day. That's not really going to significantly boost aviation in Singapore. That's not going to boost tourism in Singapore either.
Yeah, I think I saw that they're going up to 8,000, aren't they? But that's, or maybe it was 6,000. That's only about 8% of the pre-pandemic passengers.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a fraction, really, isn't it? And also causing some distortion in the market between the vaccinated, the VTL flights and the other flights, isn't it? We're seeing stories of price differentiation between because it's just some flights, isn't it, that are qualify for the VTL.
I think that's the big issue. And that, you know, yesterday or the day before, Singapore announced it would open a vaccinated travel lane with Malaysia. And, you know, there's huge demand. There's a lot of Malaysians live in Singapore, a lot of Singaporeans live in Malaysia. There's a lot of family travel. There's a lot of business travel between the two countries. But they haven't yet announced how many flights there will be per day. And as you said there, Becca, it's not all flights between the two cities that are dedicated VTL flights. So, you know, that obviously pushes up prices, pushes up demand for certain flights, and as you said, you know, it distorts the market. And you know, these caps on arrivals, Australia went through this throughout the pandemic. It had a capped number of people that could return from overseas, and that resulted in some, you know, extortionate fares, and people simply couldn't afford to travel. And we don't want to get down that route. I understand that Singapore is trying to reopen its borders carefully and as Hannah said, in a calibrated way. But, you know, you don't want to cause a distortion in the market that actually makes demand go away. And, you know, at the moment, some people may just sit and wait and see, well, maybe I'll wait till next year to actually make my trip that I would actually like to make before Christmas.
Yeah.
Gary, in the UK, Singapore Airlines have been running twice daily flights to Singapore, one of which is within the vaccinated travel program, and the other one isn't. And the fare differential is you know, anywhere up to £400 or £500 to travel on the vaccinated flight, which is just crazy. In the short term, people are paying it because, you know, they're desperate to travel, and it is that pent up demand. But as you say, in sort of the medium term, it's just not going to be sustainable.
I mean, I think we have to hope that this is just a short-term expedient to try and get more markets flying in and out of Singapore, and that, you know, from the turn of the year they will increase those caps quite considerably. But we have to wait and see. Let's
move on because we've got plenty more to have a look at. This is some information again looking at that scheduled capacity November 21 versus November 2019. And we've taken some of those countries on the left-hand side and looked at how capacity has changed both domestically and then going to and from different regions. And one of the things that really stood out for us here is one of the ways that Southeast Asia is different to elsewhere, in that it's the intra-regional travel, it's this Southeast Asia travel that's actually doing worse than other parts of the world. Elsewhere, what we're seeing is that regional travel is stronger, and then the longer the haul, the longer the stage length, the lower the travel volumes or the capacity volumes, because that's the bit that people are less confident about traveling. But here we've got a different picture, haven't we? That it's the Southeast Asia travel is the most hard hit.
It's completely at odds with every other experience around the world. You know, our expectation throughout this year has been when markets recover, travelers will be short haul in nature. They will not want to stray too far away from their home country in case there is a sudden lockdown, you know, and they want to get back. And yet here we have a bizarre situation, quite frankly, where there is a stronger capacity recovery from Singapore to Europe than there is from Singapore to the whole of Southeast Asia. How does that work? I mean, that just seems strange. And, you know, it's also, if we put the volume of seats here, the loss of capacity from Singapore to Southeast Asia is stark. It's huge. Similarly in Thailand, It's just so strange to see this, Becca. It's a unique set of data points that we have not seen in any other market, and it just highlights where the solution is and what needs to be done to reopen the whole of Southeast Asia in terms of capacity and demand. If you can't travel between any of these two countries until very recently, you know, the rest of the airline network just collapses.
It's going to be interesting to revisit this in a month or two, I think, and see if we see some changes. Gary,
I think there's 2 points there that are quite interesting. One goes back to what John said right at the beginning, and that's the cooperation between the countries in the region simply hasn't happened yet. We would hope that would happen in future. There has been issues that, you know, different countries have been at different speeds in terms of recovering from the pandemic and vaccinating their populations. That should start to not necessarily equalize, but there should be more deals done in the coming months. But the issue is also, as you're seeing these reopenings that Hannah just said, they're in-out reopenings. You know, you go into Thailand, you travel in Thailand, you go home again. Whereas before you would probably fly into Singapore, maybe take a trip out to Thailand or Vietnam or whatever, you do a multi-destination trip. And the bureaucracy that John talked about earlier at the moment just simply makes that impossible. It's simply not possible right now. And, you know, until that does come back, this travel between the region and around the region, you know, you can see still very low levels.
And
so
this is and this is one of the things that's also going to impact Singapore's success, because Singapore as a mono destination it has fairly limited appeal. Thailand, plenty of things you can do. Singapore, not really. So until it does reopen and you can travel around, Singapore is probably not going to see such a high number of inbound leisure travelers either.
And that takes us really nicely to the next slide. We've had a look at some of the large airports around the region, and just show here the ranking now compared to where they were 2 years ago. So Singapore used to be ranked 13th in the world, and now 116. It's shocking, isn't it?
Well, it's shocking, but, you know, in the context of the next 2 years, then clearly places like Singapore and Kuala Lumpur are going to recover, and Sydney will do as well. But it just shows both how far they've gone, Becca, and also how some other countries, such as China. Now, you know, if we had the list of the top 10, 20 airports in the world, China dominates this list at this moment in time.
So we've had a question about airlines with, you know, Garuda looking set to join Thai Airways and Philippine Airlines in bankruptcy protection. Thank you, Emma Connors, for your question there. Where does the health of the airlines play in this? So you say that these airports will pick up, but some of them, will they be quite vulnerable to the state of the airlines that serve them or have traditionally served them?
Well, I think some of these airports, you know, have relatively strong base carriers, and some of these airports have a larger customer base that is perhaps dominated by inbound airlines. Garuda does look set to join Thai and Philippine Airlines, and, you know, they've been in bankruptcy protection before, and they will be in bankruptcy protection again, and the governments will bail them out.
Okay, that's yeah, okay. So looking at the data in a slightly different way, what we've done here is look at using traffic data from OAG for 2019. So looking back in the past, trying to understand of the international passengers into and out of these countries, what proportion were from the home country and what proportion were from elsewhere, so foreign or home. And the data is the same for both of these two charts, but the one on the right shows it as a percentage up to 100%. So we see here that Australia has a relatively small proportion of foreign travellers travelling internationally to and from Australia, and a much higher proportion of Australian travellers. The opposite true for Vietnam and for Thailand. So I guess the point here is to say which are these markets that are most vulnerable to a loss of foreign travellers, isn't it? It's quite it's going to be harder perhaps for Thailand and Vietnam, where Australia, perhaps having all the Australians stay at home is actually, you know, in some ways there's an upside for the economy, isn't there?
Yeah, it also explains, you know, supports why Thailand has done what it has done in terms of open for everyone, because it just needs that inbound market, and it can't be fussy about where it originates from at the moment. You know, it just needs that activity to occur. Whereas in Australia, of course, it's more about the outbound market. Quite understandable, people wanting to leave Australia as quickly as they can.
Gary, how much do you see that there's an economic need to bring tourism back as driving some of the policy issues in these countries?
Well, Gary, Hannah, I mean, the link is there, isn't there? It's understood.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an economic need to bring back tourism, but then, you know, I think there is also this probable acceptance that the demand that was there before simply isn't. No, Indonesia, there's an interview tonight with the Indonesian tourism minister. He's going to be speaking on local television, and he precursed some of what he's going to say. And that's that next year, Indonesia is only really expecting or targeting 2 million visitors next year, and had something like 17 million, I think, in 2019. So we don't really know what the actual demand is going to be. So, you know, patterns of travel are probably going to shift quite considerably. Most countries, Thailand is really ramping down its expectations. It loves to make bold predictions for a full year in terms of visitor arrivals, but it's being more reticent on those at the moment, simply because until other, you know, you can open up your borders, but you can't do this alone. You need some of those other key markets to be providing travelers coming in and out. And at the moment, with this sort of stasis that we have across different parts of Asia Pacific, and particularly that, you know, this China-shaped gap, which we probably expect will endure for much of 2022, predicting actual demand for travel, it's really difficult right now.
Okay, so we're going to have a look in a moment at what that China-shaped gap means. So China being outbound travelers that aren't going to happen. First of all, we're looking at the Australian outbound. So we know that Australia is beginning to open up now. So this chart shows us in 2019 the volumes of foreign travellers travelling to and from each of from Australia to each of these countries. So number 2, New Zealand, obviously the biggest market for Australia, number 2, China. We've just shown in yellow or orange the ones that are in Southeast Asia. And then trying to see, are these available now? So if New Zealand was the largest market before, can Australians, as the country opens up, can they travel to New Zealand? Can they travel to China? They obviously can't travel to China. Can they travel to Indonesia? Can they travel to Singapore? Sort of as you're saying, Gary, some of these markets just aren't going to be available to travel to, are they? So where will this valuable Australian outbound market actually be able to go in the next few months? So that, Hannah, do you have a view about that? Where do you expect to see Australians travel in Southeast Asia now that they can travel a bit more freely without quarantining when they get home?
I mean, Bali is always a favorite, but you still have this quarantine, a 3-day quarantine that you need to undergo when you arrive in Bali. So and the Western Australian market is also still closed off. That's likely to last until next year as well. And that's, you know, a very popular route into Bali. Singapore, again, could be one. It's one of the larger outbound markets, Australia into Singapore. So that could work. Thailand again being open. Malaysia, let's see if they open up to Australia, but there've been, you know, news reports of that happening in the news the past couple of weeks. Possibly Vietnam, but I don't see Vietnam really opening in a substantial way this year. So I mean, it's probably Thailand and Indonesia who are set to benefit the most from this outbound travel, but I suspect a lot of Australians will be traveling over to Europe for kind of VFR as well, so they may well miss out.
There are also markets where travellers probably will not travel. So a good example, I think, is the Australia-China market. You know, a lot of that is friends, family, VFR stuff going back and forth. Are Australian resident Chinese now likely therefore to go to Indonesia on holiday, or to Bali, or to Singapore for a break? I'm not so sure. I think that's a market that will just will not travel. Gary, what do you think?
I think there could be a lot of wait and see. I agree with that. I think a lot of bookings that we'll see outbound from Australia will probably be sort of next summer, the European summer. I agree with Hannah as well. I think, you know, there's going to be a lot of VFR travel. People want to reconnect. Australians live around the world. Europe is a good example, the US, Singapore, Hong Kong. Well, Hong Kong isn't really possible right now. But yeah, it's a difficult market. And also, you know, a lot of people in Australia like to take January off. January is not that far away. Will people be traveling domestically this year? And, you know, just hoping that they can take a more extended and they'll have more freedom to travel if they wait until the next European summer or the next Northern Hemisphere summer. We could see a little bit of that. Just wait and see.
So it doesn't. I'm not getting a sense that Australia being a bit more open is actually going to lead then to a boom in travel. There's too many reasons for Australians still not to travel overseas, and just to wait a bit longer, isn't it?
I think there will be a boom. I think the boom will come, but I just don't think it'll be immediately.
Yeah. John, were you going to add something there?
Yeah, it's just about the complexity, isn't it? And, you know, to Gary's point and Hannah's, many people who travel out from Australia and from Europe into Southeast Asia tend to do multi-destination holidays or trips. And it's just, you know, it's just impossible to walk on each of the stepping stones without the rules and regulations changing for each of them.
Okay, so let's look at something similar, but looking at the China outbound. So this is the number, the blue bars here show the number volume of international passengers with a China point of origin for each of these countries, and on the bottom, Australia, Bangladesh, Indonesia here, India. So the blue bar shows the volume. So obviously Thailand, huge in terms of Chinese outbound travelers before the pandemic. And then the little bar here shows what that was as a proportion of the total travelers inbound to each of these countries. So for Thailand, 23% of their inbound passengers were from China. So huge loss of not having those travelers, both in terms of volume and as a proportion of the total. Cambodia here, almost a third of their visitors coming from China. So clearly the loss of Chinese travel, international travel, affects some of these markets much more than others. We're not likely to see Chinese travel come back anytime soon, are we? I think we keep pushing the data out, and maybe we're looking at middle of next year onwards.
I think beyond the middle of next year, from some of the latest news stories I've seen. You know, there is no definitive sort of dates or approach from the Chinese government and authorities towards reopening. It certainly wasn't going to be before the Winter Olympics, and that's, you know, now virtually confirmed. Beyond that, you know, there is a 5-year reset on the plan in China in the autumn of next year, and I'm hearing that that might be a point at which they will reopen. We know Chinese airlines have flipped to operating domestic services. They're not as profitable as international. I'm not sure they're all that bothered really, because ultimately the Chinese government will support those airlines. But it's the ripple effect into other markets. I mean, you know, 1 in 4 visitors that are going to Thailand are coming from China. That's huge. And for a market like Cambodia, which is even smaller, for nearly 1/3 of your inbound activity to be coming from China, and knowing that it's not going to be there for the next 12 months, it's a horrendous situation.
So Hannah, are we seeing any evidence of any of these countries in Southeast Asia actively going after other markets now? Are they looking at India or Russia? We know that there's a lot of Russians traveling. Are they actively saying, okay, we're not going to have Chinese travelers, so are there other markets we can target for inbound tourism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are still hopeful about the Chinese market, which I think is a little bit misplaced. For example, Cambodia with their Sihanoukville sandbox. I mean, Sihanoukville is traditionally a destination that is incredibly popular with the Chinese market and has a lot of connections to China, whereas the rest of the world, not really. But certainly what's interesting now is many of the governments, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, are talking about quality tourists. And I think that there's, like, by quality, you know, they're meaning high spending tourists. So it might not necessarily be the particular destination, though I think a lot of it is skewed towards the mid to long haul, but they want quality, they don't want the backpackers. And I think that's largely to try to make up for the lost revenue that this whole of Chinese tourists is going to create.
And I think
how feasible is that? Can you turn your tourism product around to attract quality as opposed to backpackers quite that easily?
I mean, not really. A lot of markets are very much geared around backpackers, and unless the government puts significant resources into helping, you know, these small tourism businesses to transform into that, you're going to see a lot of businesses go out of business. I just don't. I think a lot of it is lip service. They're saying they want quality, but really they'll take anybody. It'd be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, I agree with Hannah. I think it's lip service right now. I think governments and tourism boards know that demand is going to be relatively low until markets open up much, much more. So they're going down this line. And this is a relatively small sample, but if you look at for the first 7 days when Thailand reopened at the beginning of November, you mentioned there India and Russia. Russia was number 6 in that time in terms of the number of visitors to Thailand. But 2 markets I think everybody will be looking at is Japan and South Korea. They were number 4 and number 5. So I think everybody will be pitching to those 2 markets, particularly during the winter, because it's going to be winter in Japan and South Korea when it's the reopening season here in Southeast Asia. So those will be, but India for sure. I think everybody is looking at how they can attract more direct flights, because a lot of countries in Southeast Asia don't have any, or if they do have any, they don't have many direct flights from India. And that's where China, you know, took such a big leap over the last sort of 6 or 7 years. It just had so much capacity flying into Southeast Asia, which India didn't. You know, a lot of people have to fly in via other countries, transit somewhere else, which you simply can't do right now.
But I think, Gary, to your point about South Korea and Japan, you know, which you would think would be natural source markets, the frustration there is that, quite frankly, Japan is closed. So, you know, Japanese tourists can come out, but they can't get back home. And that's a pretty similar picture in South Korea. You know, it's pretty onerous to get in and out of the country. So the frustration, it goes back to that whole issue, doesn't it, about reciprocity of travel processes and procedures between either end of a route.
Yeah, totally, John. I mean, we've discussed this before. You know, any level of quarantine, although many countries in Southeast Asia are bringing down their quarantines to somewhere like 3-5 days or whatever, you know, they're not based on science. You can't have a quarantine that's 3 days or 5 days and then say that that's to protect your population, because it simply doesn't work. You know, we know that the quarantines were put in place in terms of the infection period for the virus. So if you're having a 3 or 5 day quarantine, is it just a safety net that you're trying to use to hide behind by saying, really, you don't actually want travel right now? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know why you would have a 3 or 5 day quarantine. It simply makes no sense.
Very, very interesting observation. Okay, let's have a quick look at what's happening with some of the airlines in the region. We've touched very briefly on airlines till now. We've got four countries here. We're showing Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand, and looking at outbound capacity, departing capacity. So it's domestic and international. When I say outbound, it's just departing, all the way from January 2019 right through to this month. And just, you see here with Singapore, for instance, all the capacity's just fallen off a cliff in March, April, as everybody knew last year, and then slowly picking up. So Singapore Airlines doing this, I guess, calibrated picking up of capacity, but still very, very low. And then in other countries, AirAsia, a bit sporadic bursts of more capacity, and then just picking up just very recently. But nothing here to say there's any airline doing a lot more than any other, is there, John? Do you want to comment on the airline?
And this plays to the whole thing we were saying earlier about, you know, Southeast Asian regional capacity and connectivity remains stranded, and it's bizarre, but that is all of the sort of reasoning behind what you see here. I mean, AirAsia have repeatedly tried to restart and get going, and they've made some more positive news and announcements in the last few days about recovery and a bit more optimism. But these 4 charts just highlight how difficult it is, and how increasingly some of these places are going to be increasingly reliant on inbound capacity from overseas. So Thailand is a great example. Its recovery will be about other airlines, the inbound carriers, those from within the region, those from the Middle East, the big 3 Middle East carriers putting more capacity back in, and of course Chinese airlines eventually returning. You can't rely on your local airlines to rebuild capacity in certainly 3 of those 4 markets. There's no doubt that in Singapore the local airlines will come back strongly and will be supported in their recovery. It's very difficult to see that being the case in either the Philippines, Malaysia, or Thailand.
Mm. And the market we haven't looked at here is Hong Kong. We haven't said very much about Hong Kong, but you have a view, John, don't you, that, I mean, Cathay is just really stuck. So of all the airlines that it's difficult to see how do they get out of this situation they're in.
Yeah, this is
Cathay's one of them.
Whereas elsewhere we talk about perhaps a recovery at worst in 2 to 3 years, I can see it taking maybe 5 years plus for Hong Kong to recover back to previous levels of capacity, and by that time what is left of the incumbent Cathay Pacific, and of course the 2 low-cost airlines, and now Greater Bay Airlines, who are in their launch phase. Last week's announcements of the Hong Kong authorities getting closer in terms of the application of Chinese quarantine requirements and travel requirements is a worrying development for Hong Kong and its position as a gateway. And whilst much of its gateway connectivity is into China, and that's where it probably sees its future, I think it's a big concern. There's a new runway that's near completion and about to be used. There's been lots of terminal expansion and new facilities, but it's stuck. And I feel sorry for Cathay. They were in the middle of quite a large expansion plan. They were using their A350s to open new routes, both to United States and Europe. And it's just all been blown away. It's gone for a ball of chalk, and you can't see it coming back quickly.
Yeah, it's very difficult, isn't it? And if Hong Kong is really has been in some ways a gateway to China, people are just going to fly directly to China in future, aren't they? They're going to go to Shanghai, they're going to go to Guangzhou. What is its market position going forward, isn't it? It's quite tricky.
It is, and to go from Hong Kong as a destination from 119 routes, many of which of course are in China, down to 41 at this moment in time. That connectivity and that multiplier effect you get from various connections has been lost. And 3-week quarantines in Hong Kong at the moment, it's just impossible for travelers to sort of plan and accept 3 weeks in a hotel.
Okay, guys, we've got 2 minutes left. So we wanted to have a quick look at who we think across the region are the winners and losers. And in our discussions before this, we weren't sure that really winners and losers was quite the way to go. So we've got a Formula One grid for you here. Gary, do you want to talk us through who's at the front of the grid, who's in pole position in terms of coming out of this whole thing, this whole 18 months pandemic that we've had, in a stronger position than the other countries?
Yeah, I'll start off and then Hannah can finish. I mean, I think as Hannah said at the beginning, the 2 countries that are in pole position, and just in terms of the way that they're approaching this, are Thailand and Singapore. They're actively trying to reopen, they're actually trying to find ways to bring back travel of all kinds, Thailand, mostly it's a leisure market. Singapore, it's a very complex market, a lot of business travel. VFR, and there's some tourism in there as well, but it's a much more complex market. But you know, those two are the two that really have actually gone out on a limb, and they're sitting at the front of the grid right now. And behind them, it's a real bit of a mixed bag. So Hannah, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so you've got countries like Malaysia and Cambodia who have really high vaccination rates. I think Cambodia has the highest in Southeast Asia right now, but they've kind of come out with this half-cooked idea of reopening. They're not really playing to their strengths, you know, the fact that it is so fully vaccinated. Malaysia, they're testing the waters with Langkawi, but again, very highly vaccinated, could have real potential if they chose to reopen. And towards the back there, we've got countries like Vietnam, who have very low rates of vaccination still, are going to perhaps reopen. Their domestic travel is certainly going to pick up, I think, towards the end of the year, towards Tet. And you've got some countries that are just only going to be playing next year. So Laos maybe will reopen next year. You've got the Laos-China railway that's due to open at the beginning of December. Whether that will be open to tourists is another thing. It may just be freight at this time. And New Zealand, who, you know, seem to really be quite firmly borders shut at the moment. So like Gary said, it's a mixed bag. It's anybody's race to win right now.
So really, really great way to end this. Thank you both very much. John, Gary, Hannah, any final comments or observations? I think we've covered a lot of ground, so I'm not sure there's much more to say.
Things can only get better. I think you know, if you listen to what we've just said, you may see it as a pretty grim situation, and it has been. But I think the other side of this is, you know, if the recovery can be replicated in the way it has been in other markets, and we can get some consistency of approach at a bilateral level between countries, then the opportunities for the first half of 2022, notwithstanding China, are actually really positive. You know, there is lots of capacity waiting to be used. There are airlines waiting to fly. They just need to have very clear and simple processes and messaging that they can then allow people to fly as well.
Yeah, clear and simple, absolutely, 100%. And I'll steal a point that Hannah said earlier. You know, it's all eyes on Thailand right now. If Thailand successfully reopens over the next sort of three months, and it proves that it can attract travelers safely in large numbers, and people can enjoy their holidays, you know, that will encourage other countries to be a bit more expansive. But you know, perhaps not yet.
That's really great. Thank you, all three of you, very much indeed. We'll draw the webinar to a close now. We'll be back with a more Australia, New Zealand focused webinar on the 1st of December. So do sign up for that when you get an opportunity to. And thank you very much for joining us today. You can contact OAG for more details about any of that data that we've shown you. And thanks very much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thanks.
Thanks.